Good evening and welcome to the Finger Lakes Wine Alliance Riesling Launch virtual tasting. We have with us tonight 24 media and bloggers who are going to taste and follow along with our tasting. My name is Jeff Hauk. I'm the winemaker at Lucas Vineyards. I'm going to be our panel coordinator this evening and also one of the panel members on our first panel. I'm going to quickly just go through our first flight. How this evening's schedule is going to work, we're going to have 2 flights of wine. The first flight is 4 dry Rieslings. We're all from the Finger Lakes, of course. And our second flight is Rieslings with different sugar levels. And they've been flighted according to the sweetness. And in the first flight, we have Ravines Wine Cellars Dry Riesling, Dr. Constantine Frank Wine Cellars Dry Riesling, Lucas Vineyards Dry Riesling, and then we have Sheldrake Point's Dry Riesling. At this point, we're hoping that you folks have had a chance to try these wines. I'd like to introduce our first winemaker this evening, Morton Hallgren from Ravines Wine Cellars. Morton is a longtime Finger Lakes winemaker and has recently, fairly recently, started his own winery. He's making some great stuff. Morton, would you like to talk to us a little bit about your 2011 Dry Riesling?
Sure. 2011 was a challenging year, but it was a year that sort of validated certain practices, both in the vineyard and in the winery. It was a year that did present certain challenges in the vineyard, especially when it came to botrytis, and as a winemaker who strives to work exclusively on drier Riesling, I was very much seeking to avoid the botrytis and relied, of course, heavily on the growers that I work with, but I was very happy to bring in Riesling that was, by and large, botrytis free, which is really critical for the style of Riesling we're striving for, more on the floral, mineral side, crisp, clean aromas. We don't look for botrytis or sweetness, so the absence of botrytis was really important. Also, we insist on working with hand-harvested grapes, and so it allows us to whole cluster press them and get a nice, gentle extraction with long press cycles. I feel this is very important for dry Riesling in particular, where your flavors sort of stand alone.
Thanks, Morton. There was a couple of questions for you. One of our writers noticed you were trained in the south of France, and they were interested in how you incorporate old world techniques in your Finger Lakes winery and challenges you've had in trying to do so.
Certainly, absolutely. The way we practice is it starts with hand harvesting, and it starts with the site selection. I basically searched through the Finger Lakes and identified some vineyards I felt strongly lend themselves to this style of dry Riesling with a little more floral, mineral aromas, and then it's a combination of good vineyard management practices and good sites to keep the vineyards clean of botrytis. And then on the winemaking side, I really insist on these longer press cycles to have a minimum of solids, keep nice clean juice coming out, long cool fermentations, and one thing I might do a little bit differently is also bring in this use of the lighter lees, the broken down yeast cells that we stir throughout the winter to soften up the wine, give them a little richer texture and mouthfeel without, again, getting into the higher RS, the sweeter style wine. So I would say that's probably, I mean, it's fairly traditional winemaking, and I find that becoming in a relatively young wine region where we have so many things to zero in on.
One other question for you, Morton, before we have to move on to our next panelist. Another person had asked about other world regions that Finger Lakes wines are modeled on, or is it completely unique? Could you address that, how you feel about that?
Certainly, I would say it is completely unique. It is a very continental climate. The temperature variations here are far more extreme than I've seen it anywhere in Europe, in Champagne and Burgundy, in Germany. As a winemaker, you really have to be prepared for a little bit of everything. But what's really amazing about the Finger Lakes is that it's perhaps the most promising of the cool climate wine regions in the New World, and it is up to us collectively to shape and form it as we best see fit. So I consider it a unique opportunity, and I'm not looking to copy any old world region.
Thank you very much, Morton. We had one other question I wanted to get just before I move on, and I'll let any of you guys speak to this that want to. One of our writers had read conflicting reports regarding global warming in the Finger Lakes. Some claim benefits the Finger Lakes. Does anyone want to speak to whether they agree or disagree?
I'll make one comment, Bob Medill, and that is that what I've noticed is that unlike in other years, now we're seeing early springs. And if it's quite possible this is an effect of global warming, and personally I don't welcome that particular news because it subjects us to a problem we haven't had in the past, and that is perhaps an early frost as well. And I think 2012 was probably an example of that, where that was possible. Other than that, all of us speculate about the drama of some of the weather in a contributing factor. We've seen a little bit of it in the Finger Lakes. What do you think, Fred?
I would agree with that. In 50 years of growing, over 50 years growing vinifera at our site on Keuka Lake, we've never had spring frost, and we had a small amount of damage, about 5% this spring. So we're not sure if that's an anomaly or if it could be a trend.
So good segue to move on and introduce Fred. Those of you who are familiar with Finger Lakes wines have probably heard of Dr. Constantine Frank Wine Cellars. Fred's families are definitely have been involved in the start of vinifera grape growing in the Finger Lakes, and right up until this point is one of the most widely known wineries, and they do a great job. Fred, Frank, could you please talk to us a little bit about your 2011 dry Riesling?
Sure. Thank you, Jeff, and welcome everyone. The 2011 dry Riesling has done very well for us in competitions. We've won 7 gold medals thus far in both national and international wine competitions, and I think the reason that Riesling has become a benchmark variety for the Finger Lakes is its consistency. Even with changing weather from year to year, we still manage to make outstanding Rieslings that win many awards and get good ratings. And so I think this is the mark of a benchmark variety for a region. And so we've been growing Riesling now for over 50 years, and we feel it's obviously well suited to the Finger Lakes. So we've been expanding our acreage with newer vineyards, and also maintaining our older plantings. The Finger Lakes Riesling is really gaining more and more credibility and notoriety, and it's allowed us to expand our distribution to over 30 states. So our wines are available. I noticed a number of the attendees are from states outside of New York, and our wines are available in about 30 states. So it is challenging to educate folks about the renaissance that's occurred in New York wines. We call it missionary work when we go out of state and attend tastings and educate folks that a renaissance has occurred in New York wines, started by Dr. Constantine Frank introducing the vinifera to New York, and now we have 330 wineries and growing in New York. When he started back in '62, there were only a dozen. So we can really see tremendous growth. And I think there's a real interest now in wines that are from cool climate regions, more moderate in alcohol, have a nice crisp acidity, and go very well with food. And so this trend, I think, is really helping the Finger Lakes to grow.
You kind of touched base on a couple of questions that were asked, Fred, so I'm going to kind of give you a two-part thing. and see if you can handle both of them there. How many acres of Riesling are currently planted in the Finger Lakes? And when you finish that one, do you kind of address that, I think. Do you think we need to plant more Riesling? And the other question was, do you feel age of the Finger Lakes Riesling vines is important in the final product? So again, it was the acreage of Finger Lakes Riesling.
Yes. There's about 900 acres currently of Riesling in the Finger Lakes, and that number, of course, is growing. So I'm sure we'll surpass 1,000 acres fairly soon. Our winery has purchased additional land, and we're growing more Riesling each year. And we also experiment with different clones of Riesling. So there are a number of clones. Some have been selected in Germany at research stations there, some in Alsace. And we find that a variety of clones in the wine adds to the complexity of the wine. And we also make multiple styles of Riesling. Another great thing about it is the diversity of Riesling. So we make everything from a sparkling Riesling to a dry Riesling, medium dry, semi-dry, and a bunch select late harvest dessert style. So this really shows the incredible diversity that we have with Riesling. And we're blessed with some old vine vineyards that Constantine planted going all the way back to 1958. And in Europe, where old vine vineyards are more common, many of the winemakers there believe that the quality from these old vine vineyards is superior. And there's several theories as to why. One is that the older vines naturally have lower yields, and that adds to the concentration and quality in the fruit. Another aspect is the deeper roots go into the subsoil layers and pick up trace nutrients that younger vines' shallow roots don't approach. And then finally, the thick trunks of these old vines act as carbohydrate storage. So this is kind of the theory in Europe why the old vine vineyards are superior for quality. So we're blessed with a number of these old vines that Constantine planted over 50 years ago.
Thank you very much, Fred. Great information. I'm going to move on next to my own wine. Again, I'm Jeff Hauk. I'm the winemaker at Lucas Vineyards on Cayuga Lake. I have you tasting this evening my 2011 dry Riesling, and hope you enjoy it. We're a fairly small producer of Riesling with a couple thousand cases a year, so compared with some of these guys, fairly small amount. All of our fruit is estate-grown, hand-picked fruit, and I enjoy having the same source of grapes each year to work with. It allows me, I feel, to make a pretty consistent product and fairly reliable flavors from year to year. With our dry Riesling, a lot of times for me, I'm tasting a lot of lime and peach fruit flavors in that, and hopefully you picked up on some of that this evening. Generally, our approach with Riesling is fairly minimalist, where we let the vineyard kind of make the wine and try and get out of the way of it, and not do tremendous amount. I don't feel you need to with the winemaking. If you grow great grapes in the Riesling, it'll express itself in the bottle. And anyone out there has any questions, be happy to answer them. Some of the questions we had beforehand about the 2011 vintage in particular, just wanted to touch base with that. 2011 was a very challenging year in the Finger Lakes. We've talked about it at some of our other virtual tastings, and these guys have touched on it. We had excessive rain during the ripening period, caused a lot of berries to swell, and there was some rot problems. And it really separated the good grape growers from those that didn't do a good job. But it also showed us something that some of us were discussing earlier. 20 years ago, it probably would have been a terrible harvest. But with our advances in canopy management and taking better care in our vineyards, we were, for the most part, able to bring in clean fruit and do a great job in making wines from 2011, which I think still hold firm. They have beautiful acid profile. They really show very well. And so for us, and did we find ourselves harvesting earlier? Another person had asked that question. It varied from vineyard to vineyard. There was some disease pressure, and some grapes were picked at an earlier, less ripe than they might be in a typical year, but again, it varied throughout the Finger Lakes. And in general, I would say that Finger Lakes winemakers are very happy with the overall quality of the 2011 vintage. And with that, I'm going to reintroduce Bob Medill, my neighbor from down the road. Bob's also on Cayuga Lake, and we have kind of a close fraternity of Finger Lakes owners, winemakers. Bob's a good friend and does a great job at Sheldrake Point. He calls himself the wine grower there. And he's probably one of the biggest proponents of Finger Lakes wine in the Finger Lakes. He really has promoted the region along with Sheldrake Point, which does a fabulous job with Riesling, and he's a great one to speak about Riesling. So tell us a little bit about your dry Riesling, Bob.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. And speaking to people in 11 different states, by the way, if you didn't know that. Excuse me. We have about 20% of our production is Riesling, and as most of the growers here, the producers, we produce several styles, 5 styles that go from dry right to Riesling ice wine. So we cover the gamut. It's great to be a neighbor to Jeff and Lucas because we've had to borrow equipment, and when something breaks down, you can go next door and get a tractor. It makes a big deal. It's a lot of difference. Our 3 blocks, we have 3 blocks, were planted between 1997 when we first arrived at Sheldrake to 2001, and quite imaginatively they're called R1, R2, and R3. And the 2011 wine is a combination of 2 blocks. The younger of the wine of the vineyards at the blocks at Sheldrake. Everybody's saying it's a challenging year, and it was. We were able to wait out the worst part of the weather because what happened in the end of October is the sun came out, and for the next 2 or 3 weeks it was just gorgeous, beautiful, beautiful day, every day. And so we harvest this wine on November 9th, which is quite late for us. Normally at Sheldrake, the Riesling's harvest between October 15th and 21st. And I've got 6 vintages were like that, just as regular as clockwork. So we'll see what climate change brings or doesn't bring to us in this region. The character of the wine is interesting to me. As I think most of my colleagues agree, if there's one wine that's made in the vineyard, it's certainly Riesling. And as Jeff has indicated, we too follow a very minimalist approach. Cool fermentation, allowing the wine, we use one yeast, Epernay 2, which tends to slow on its own, and we stop it with chilling, and normally that's it. And when we make a dry Riesling, it's normally unadulterated. If we make a reserve Riesling, it's certainly hands off, we don't touch it. It's just basically whatever comes in from the vineyard. So it's a bit of an interesting prospect when you think about making a wine, and it truly is a product of the place that you are growing your grapes and the vintage that you're handed. And I think most of the regions in their Finger Lakes reflect those 2 attributes. They are characteristic of where they're grown and the nature of the climate and the circumstances of each vintage. And that makes our region quite compelling and quite interesting because the styles are quite different depending on local circumstances.
Bob, could you speak for a moment about, one of our questions was about if anyone vinifies Riesling with botrytis.
Oh yeah.
And if anyone makes iced wine from Riesling. And I think this applies directly to you, so.
Yeah, well, we started making ice wine. We made our first ice wine in 2000. I'm from Ontario, and when I came down here, I was surprised that a few of the vineyardists were making ice wine because we're ideally suited as a climate to make ice wine, and a classical ice wine, frozen on the vine, brought down to the press, pressed immediately. In terms of botrytis, there are certainly 2 reasons I do not look for botrytis. One is in the dry Riesling, and the other one would be in ice wine. Ice wine to me is non-botrytis affected. Late harvest styles, which we can produce here, just gorgeous late harvest wines. Fred, you're producing one now. Superb wine, superb wines. Anthony Road is producing. So in some of our wines, the sweeter Rieslings, the late harvest styles, yes, botrytis, no problem. In the ice wine and in the dry Riesling, nope. We'll do field selection and selection on the crush pad to remove botrytis from those two styles of wine.
Bob or any of the rest of the panel would like to speak. We had a question concerning, is there a clone that's used to either embrace botrytis or to avoid it?
I don't think so. I don't think we're
I
aware
think
of it.
it's more environmental,
Okay.
depending on the year, the amount of humidity.
Was that the basic question? Was
You get botrytis growth when you have moisture and warmth. So, for example, this year we've had beautiful warm days and incredibly cool nights. So you get everything just going into stasis when you get that. You get ripening without any effect of disease pressure.
So Bob, you're going to be the lucky one, and anyone else can chime in. Our favorite winemaker word, terroir. One of our questions, someone had asked about the characteristics of grapes from the different lakes, and it's something, I think, one of the things we hear a lot about in our tasting rooms, and it comes up in discussions all the time. Bob, would you like to speak to it? And we have a few minutes. I think we could kind of let Morton and Fred and myself also. So why don't you go ahead, Bob? And
First, I think it's important to understand the diversity of this region. Number one, we are a moderated continental climate, yet if I were to look at for example, the amount of rainfall that will happen at Sheldrake in a given vintage versus over in Keuka Lake, let's say, where Fred might be, or Morton, that can vary considerably from year to year. So some of the very essential characters of growing things, the amount of rain you receive, for example, can vary across this region quite considerably. The other thing you must remember is that our vineyards are situated at different aspects. Some of them face east, some of them face west. At Sheldrake, for example, where we're facing east, we can have up to 6-degree temperature difference between the bottom of the vineyard and the top of the vineyard, rising only 100 feet. And we've got vineyards that, for example, Fred, yours are up above Keuka Lake quite high.
High elevation.
High elevation. So the elevations in our region vary considerably. Specifically, I know that I've had this conversation with Morton, and the reason for that is that we've had a number of people coming through, Kevin Zraeli, Josh Green, Mary Ewing Mulligan, asking the same sort of question. And my take on it is simply that in a given vintage, we can find characteristic styles, and between vintages, they can come from different producers.
I would just like to add that whereas most of the Finger Lakes is certainly acidic shale-stone, you have a few pockets of predominant limestone soil. In particular, the vineyard site I work with in St. Margaret's Vineyard on the southeastern side of Seneca Lake, and also in our newly acquired vineyard up outside of Geneva, sort of the extension of the Niagara Escarpment. Here you find Riesling on calcareous soil, and it certainly does lend a different profile to the fruit coming out of there. So I think that's adding yet another dimension to the Riesling that we'll have to explore over the next many years.
did you want to add anything to that, Fred?
Well, just in general, the soil pHs tend to be more acidic on Keuka Lake. We tend to have rockier soils, steeper slopes. We tend to source our Riesling for our dry Riesling primarily from Keuka. We see more of a minerality coming from these rocky soils there. And then Seneca Lake typically has deeper loamy soils, and the pH tends to be more acidic in the south, and then it gets more basic as you head north into the limestone area that Morton was talking about.
Interestingly, too, I think a lot of us are finding even on our own farms there's differences within the soil type. And I know Tricia and Peter at Fox Run have done some work with different flavors from the different vineyards within the same farm. And so discussing from lake to lake, when you have differences that are located that close, it's pretty hard to make broad generalizations about different flavors from lake to lake. Like Morton said, what's more likely is that there's specific differences throughout the Finger Lakes, and we can't necessarily just say Keuka Lake vineyards have this quality and Cayuga Lake this quality.
what I've noticed is that in some of the vintages, this character, this differentiation does show up with more drama. For example, 2003, 2006. We're shallow, Howard Gravelly loam over shale, and I think some of the character of the wines from those vintages comes out directly from that relationship. And I think we, on those very specific vintages, we get more differentiation in the region than this. 11, I think there's a lot more similarity.
So we're out of time for our first panel. I want to thank our first group of panelists, and we're going to take a quick break and pour wine for our second group of winemakers. And thanks again, guys, and we'll be right back. We're ready to talk about our second flight of the evening. A quick shout out, happy birthday to Gary, one of our folks that is tasting this evening. And also happy birthday to one of our panelists' wife, Lori, Steve's beautiful wife, and she has to work tonight, so she can't be here tasting wine. We're going to quickly go through and the wines for the second flight. We have the 2011 Reserve Riesling from Fox Run Vineyards, 2011 Riesling from Swedish Hill Winery, 2011 Riesling from Lakewood, and 2011 Riesling from Knapp Winery and Vineyard. And we're going to go right in. I'm going to introduce our first panelist this evening. We have Tricia, and Tricia, I'm going to say your last name wrong, right?
Sure, Renshaw.
Renshaw.
You got it.
Somehow I wanted to make it some different name. I apologize. Tricia is the assistant winemaker at Fox Run Vineyards. She has been working with Peter Bell there for a number of years. I've had the pleasure of tasting wine with Tricia for quite a few years. She has one of the best palates in the Finger Lakes and has a real knack for descriptors. You'd have a lot of fun if you ever get a chance to taste wine with her. She's doing a great job at Fox Run. Tricia, could you tell us a little bit about the 2011 Reserve Riesling?
I'd be glad to. Thank you so much. One of the things that at Fox Run we really appreciate making wine where we do is that we have the right to call any wine a reserve wine. And some people think that that might be cynical because you can make a reserve wine any year. You can call anything a reserve wine and charge a little bit more for it. On the other hand, it gives us freedom. And so for people who use it responsibly, the right to call something reserve when you've got something that's very special to you, you can put out something that's very personal. And so when you come to a wine store or into a winery and taste a wine, hopefully every reserve wine that you pick up will have a lot of meaning from the winemaker. In the case of the 2011 Reserve, what we have is a semi-dry wine, which we find to be exactly the kind of semi-dry wine we want to make. And if we could make it every year, we would. But it's one of those gifts. You have it sometimes, and sometimes you get almost there, but not quite there, and we call it semi-dry. Every once in a while, we hit it exactly right, and we'll call it reserve. In the past, we've actually had dry reserves, and customers have followed right along with us. We thought that might be very confusing, but they seem to understand it just fine. If we could produce a wine that was our dry style in exactly what we wanted, gossamer, light, lime, and minerals, perfect. We'll call that reserve. In a year when we can produce a semi-dry that's very soft and approachable, but also very serious, and has intensity and depth and viscosity, and enough acidity to be just absolutely delicious, that will get our reserve. And that's what happened in this case. The grapes that we picked did have a little bit of botrytis, and we were looking for that. We cultivated it. It was clean botrytis. We went out and smelled the bunches as things were growing and made sure that what we were developing was noble rot and not sour rot, because as everyone knows, botrytis can go either way. If it's clean and dry, it's going to be marmalade and concentrated and delicious. And if the weather isn't your friend, it's going to rot on the vine and you'll have vinegar before you ever pick a grape. So what we had was beautiful, noble rot. Not a whole lot of it, but enough to lend those marmalade notes and the viscosity. We let it hang out just a little bit. When we picked it, we brought it in and just standard white wine treatment for modern winemaking, crushing and pressing, fermenting with Epernay too, because a lot of us have found that yeast strain brings out these peachy round flavors in our wines and protects the acidity, and we're able to stop it right where we want to. it's adaptable that way and leads to a beautiful right round mouthfeel that we're looking for in our semi-dries. When the sweetness level and the acidity and the alcohol felt just right, we stopped the fermentation. And we watched it develop for a period of a few months in a tank just to make sure it was going to live up to our expectations and was going to develop the way we wanted. And it did, and so we bottled it and called it Reserve.
Great, thanks, Tricia. I had a couple questions I'm going to let you speak to. One of them was about the acidity being striking in Finger Lakes Rieslings. What feature of the Finger Lakes AVA gets credit for this? The reason I brought it up is I tasted this wine last week. I had a chance to try it in New York, and I love the acid balance in that wine. I thought it was just electric.
Oh, thank
So,
you so much.
would you like to talk a little bit about the acidity in Finger Lakes Rieslings?
Oh, sure. And I agree. I think it's one of the most important aspects of these wines. We maintain this beautiful package where we can have weight and we can have sugar and we can have flavor intensity, but because we have that acid, we have balance, and these wines are so compelling. The reason we have it, I believe, is because of our cool climate. It is, we have cool nights, so we're not respiring acid all night long like we might in a warmer climate. And we're able to get ripening with these nice sunny days, but because they're cooler temperatures and cooler nights, we retain that acidity and keep that for our finished wines.
Okay, at this point, we're going to go on and we're going to, I'd like to introduce Derek Wilbur, longtime winemaker with Swedish Hill Winery. Derek is one of the people who's been making wine in this region a long time. He has a great reputation in the region. Swedish Hill wins too many awards to name. I don't have time to go through them all, but year in and year out, the Riesling is a consistent gold medal winner, and Derek does a great job. Derek, could you tell us a little bit about the 2011 Riesling?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff, and hello, everybody. We've had a lot of conversation about Rieslings are made in the vineyard. We actually source Rieslings from several locations. We have some family-owned vineyards and also some purchased vineyards. This particular vineyard is actually on the western shore of Seneca Lake, which probably 7 years out of 10 will make a dry style Riesling. This is a little bit about the things that we don't know, and we know a lot, but a lot of things we don't know. And this is very much a wine that sort of spoke to us during fermentation. This semi-sweet style is when we're looking for those riper characters, a little bit more stone fruit, peach, and apricot. And often this vineyard doesn't express those things. So this last year in 2011, for whatever reason, it did. And part of our process in terms of winemaking is to sort of taste these wines through fermentation and make decisions while the while the fermentation is going on. What are we going to do with these things? And this was an unusual year for this particular vineyard, where these ripe characters are very, very pronounced. As other people talked about, and Tricia mentioned, this was one vineyard that we did use Epernay 2 in. So halfway through the fermentation, we sort of started deciding, well, maybe this is one that we're going to use for a semi-sweet or semi-dry style, not a dry style Riesling. It's a little bit lower in alcohol than our dry style, a little over 11%. So we made that decision 2/3 of the way through fermentation to stop it a little earlier than we typically would. And it did get those really ripe characters. And so it speaks both to the things we know about our vineyards and things we don't know. And so much of there's a lot of talk about being minimalist winemakers, but that doesn't mean we just start these things and walk away. Throughout the whole process, it's an evolution, and we have to sort of, it sounds trite, but we have to listen to our fermentations and see where they're going and make decisions while the process goes on. And this is one of those years where it surprised us. I think more years than not, this particular vineyard would have been our dry style. It didn't this last year. A lot of people have talked about the challenges of the 2011 vintage, and that's a word I always sort of feel mixed about. It was a vintage where people were giving it the death knell before we ever harvested a grape. And I think the important thing for all of us here is that, we do have a hand in all this. And both from better viticulture and how we handle things in the cellar, we narrow those gaps in terms of what Mother Nature presents to us. And I think that Riesling in particular shows that so well. We have these vastly different seasons, but fairly narrow styles within that. And I think that speaks to the appropriateness of the variety for our region.
That's great. We also talked a little bit about, Derek, that someone had asked this question. Typically, for Swedish Hill, what kind of harvest parameters do you use for picking in Riesling?
Most of it has to do with what we call physiological ripeness. Crude numbers can vary from season to season, but a lot of it has to do with what the grapes look like, their texture, their appearance, and how they taste. our harvest parameter is actually very relatively narrow from vintage to vintage. We're looking over the last 10 or 15 years, and our crude sugar numbers don't vary by much more than 1.5% to 2% in vastly different growing seasons. And I think, again, that speaks to the appropriateness of the variety. Most of it, again, is just seeing what the vineyards are and tasting them, and the crude numbers really don't impact us in terms of when we make a decision.
Very good. Any questions out there, Steph? There. Okay, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next panelist this evening. From Lakewood Vineyards, we have Liz Stamp. Liz's family is probably one of the most loved families in the Finger Lakes. Lakewood has a great reputation. Her husband Chris is the winemaker. They have made great Riesling for years. Again, another one, they do great wine competitions and just have a great reputation in the region and by wine connoisseurs and just tourists alike. And Liz, I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about the 2011 Riesling you brought tonight.
Thank you. Obviously, by my introduction, you can tell I'm not the most technical part of our winemaking team. I kind of feed the winemaker, that's my main thing, and then sell the wine that he makes. So on the technical side, I had to have a little coaching, which is actually good because it makes me dig a little deeper than I normally would for our, what we need to know in the tasting room. But this wine is 90% from our farm, 10% from a grower on the west side of Keuka Lake who's a great character and does a terrific job with his grapes, just doesn't have enough of them. But we have 5 blocks of Riesling on our farm, and blocks 1, 3, and 4 are what this wine's comprised of. I think we find that the blocks from our own farm tend to make up this style Riesling, the sweeter style Riesling in most cases. And then the several growers that we purchase from seem to consistently bring us the Rieslings that we're using for our drier style Riesling. And we don't just sit there and wait for the grapes to come in. We're pretty active in the vineyard, as everybody suggested, in watching the development and ripening of these grapes. I didn't put a very wordy description on the spec sheet that we sent you because everybody else has much more elaborate adjectives than I do, so I hope that you can describe it on your own. But I think generally our sweeter style Riesling, and this is true to that, certainly shows a little more of the peach and apricot, but there's a real good amount of citrus showing through this wine. And I think the thing I appreciate about the 11 vintage and in the 9 vintage, I love the ageability of these cooler years, actually.
That's great. So I think you're the first one who's mentioned some of the ageability of these cooler, wetter years.
We have a pretty complete library at our winery, and we use our library wines occasionally for different things, and we pay attention to what those years were like. And I'm probably one of those people that people are like, why do you remember the weather in that year? I remember the weather in that year because it affected what I had to do the whole next year, what wines I was describing and selling. But I think overall those cooler years really make beautifully ageable wines, and they're so youthful for such a long time.
That's a great point. I know we've had a chance to do some vertical tastings and have seen the same thing these cooler years. Liz, we had talked a little bit earlier that you might be able to talk a little bit about the importance of the IRF scale that a lot of people are seeing on Finger Lakes Riesling labels and how it can assist the consumer with their decision.
During this Riesling launch month, a number of wineries who are represented by the same distributor have been pouring each other's wines at stores. So I had the opportunity to pour Rieslings from 5 different producers several times this month. And luckily, each of those Rieslings had the IRF scale, because as I rushed out of the winery to these appointments, I realized all I know is what they say on the label, dry Riesling or just Riesling or semi-sweet Riesling. But the IRF scale certainly helped me order the wines to pour for consumers, and I made a point of pointing out that scale so that people would understand they could use that in selecting the sweetness range that they enjoy the most. And I think it's going to be a great tool when people know about it. We have a lot more education to do to get people to understand it and see that they can find a range that they like best for certain occasions or just in general. So I think it's a terrific tool, and I think it's a nice way to lend some consistency to a grape that's got great versatility but can confuse consumers.
Thank you. Liz, I'm going to throw another one out to you, and then I'm going to let some of the other panelists speak to it. What market do the four of you feel like you wish you had more of a presence in? And do you see Riesling gaining in popularity in the U.S. or New York, to be specific? And I'm just going to kind of shoot it back and forth between you guys. So what market do you wish you had more of a share in? And do you think Riesling is gaining in popularity right now?
Well, I think Riesling's gaining in popularity, and from the standpoint of someone that spends quite a bit of time interacting with consumers, both in my tasting room and in stores, people come in seeking Riesling, and even if they weren't aware that I was pouring just Riesling, so, oh, you're pouring Riesling, I love Riesling, and they have a bottle of red wine, which is what they intended to purchase at that store. So I think that the awareness of Finger Lakes Rieslings and the enthusiasm for it is certainly growing. So,
One of the other panelists want to take that question.
We're seeing a lot of excitement about our wines in New York City, which has been phenomenal. They're pouring dry wines, semi-dry, right up to the very sweetest ones. They want to know what it is that we're doing, what we're excited about, what we're passionate about, how things are going, what our experiments are we doing, what are we learning about our soils, all the journeys that we're making right now in this very exciting time in the Finger Lakes. It's a great time of exploration and expansion and artistic expression as we're all learning what is it that we really like to do and finding out how to push these ideas into wines, bringing them to a place like New York where they're excited about every little thing we're doing, bringing those wines to people in restaurants and small wine bars. And now we're seeing traffic coming up from New York. People who were exposed to these wines are now getting in their cars and driving up, a drive they were never making. They were not making years ago. We're seeing more and more people coming into our tasting rooms just excited about what's going on right here in their own backyard, and that's been really gratifying.
I think any business person would say they'd like any market to be a market that they can have a valuable presence in. I think one of the humbling things about the wine industry, there's an article this today in Wines and Vines that in the last year or so, the growth in the fine wine market, 50% of it has been the three largest wineries. And I think it's important for us all to keep in mind, we're very, 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 very tiny mammals in the world, large dinosaurs, and we have to work very, very hard to get our presence known. One of the nice things about this is that we get people to get to try our wines, because we can just get overrun by the big boys, and we're not the big boys by any stretch of the imagination.
Steve, did you want to?
Yeah, I think the farm to table movement helps us, and the interest in local products to things that are grown right here, and you can outsource lots of things, but you can't outsource our lakes or our local agriculture and our growers. The winemakers who are here, I guess, can move around, but it is pretty neat to see people who are interested in unique things now, and it's not just all generic big Chardonnay, Cabernet. It's people who are interested in new varieties and new types of food and things that are more carefully nurtured.
Definitely looking for the local connection. We had one other question, which I'll just throw out. I think it's an easy answer, like that consumers want. We had a few consumers who are with some of these tasting groups. How can they help? I think it's the old push-pull thing. What happens for us in the market is that they go into their stores and ask for the Finger Lakes wines. It's got to be a pull where the customers want it. It doesn't necessarily do the whole bunch of us panelists this evening going out and hammering on store owners. We need customers going in and asking for Finger Lakes wines. That's the pull. That's how they can help the Finger Lakes wines get into their area. So with that, I'm going to move on to our next panelist. He's a pretty special guy. He's Steve. I met a long time ago when I first got in the wine industry. He's definitely a mentor and helped me when I first started working in the winery. He used to be our winemaker at Lucas Vineyards, and I worked with him for a long time. And he does a great job with Riesling. Glenora and Knapp. He's representing Knapp. Glenora and Knapp are sister wineries. And Steve makes probably as much Riesling as any of our people here this evening. Does a great job. Again, another one that wins all kinds of awards for his Riesling. And he's another one of our senior members. He's been around for a while, and he can answer any of your questions about things that have been going on in this region for a long time. So we have Steve DeFrancesco. Steve, can you talk to us about your 2011 Riesling?
Sure, Jeff. Thank you for that introduction. And we had some great times years ago.
Oh yeah,
Learning
much
the
fun.
hard way about things. You know, and seeing things
Most
that
definitely.
we want to do again, or we might not want to do it that way again. So
Exactly.
learning the hard way. But this is our 11 Riesling. We have on our farm we have 3 blocks of Riesling, maybe 5 acres, and then we also manage another farm that's just north of us that has about 4 acres probably. So we have 5 different blocks there, plus we purchased some fruit. This one happens to be all from the eastern side of Seneca Lake, and this one worked out a little bit better for a semi-dry. It's got some dried lemon flavors that carry through, and kind of nicely integrated lemon with some of the nice acidity and just a touch of apricots maybe. But Rieslings are the nice thing about them in an area like this is that we can pick them over some years. In 2010, we picked over 5 weeks of time, and Chardonnay would never work that way. I mean, Chardonnay 2 days later might be rotten. So I mean, you've got to really be on the edge of that, or with the tight clustered varieties like Pinot Blanc. But Riesling can, there are so many, you can make components from different magic little places in the Finger Lakes and assemble them later, sort of in a champagne method of putting a cuvee together to make them work out with the flavors as well as the acidity and the sugars. Sometimes the Epernay too decides where the sugar wants to be because it gets stuck. So, but that gives us some pretty fun options, actually.
Steve, I'm going to put you on the spot with the 2011. Did 2011 vintage meet, exceed, or disappoint?
I think it has its own good things to say about it, and it says a lot about what a few of us have been saying tonight about working in the vineyards, because the canopy management that we've figured out now is so much different than many years ago. In 1987 was a similar year, really warm in the summer and dry, and then it rained like crazy. You remember 87 there?
You do.
And what we used to call, well, I won't get into it, but what this lacase was a byproduct of botrytis that continues to rot after the grapes have even been pressed, and we had issues with that. Now the canopies are managed so much better, opened up, get the air through, get the light in, get the right kind of light where it's not too much if it's too hot, but just enough filtered light and air mainly, and the location and our sunlight that hits our vines is just so critical to what we do. And if you're paying attention, you shouldn't have a disaster anymore like we used to when there was so much vegetative growth years ago.
Another question, Steve. We had someone ask about extraction, and what is the benefit of a long and gentle process? Would you talk a little bit about extraction? I'm thinking maybe they're talking about phenolics.
Sure. If we have the right kind of harvester, like a Gregoire harvester from France, it's very gentle and it knocks the berries off of the stems. And we can do overnight skin contact if everything looks right. And the flavors and the phenolics the flavors are in the skins, near the skins. Phenolics can be near the seeds, but the quality of that maceration is really important. And if we pick up a little bit of a phenolic type of a good phenolic, that's almost like the white part of a grapefruit or an orange, you know, that can be good and give you some body or texture.
Well, we're nearing the end. If we have any final questions, Stephanie, that we can throw out to our panel. We'll check my notes and make sure we've... one other question, we had asked why someone was a little disappointed, I took from their question, that none of us use screw caps on our Riesling. Would any of you guys like to speak to why your wines are not in screw caps?
Sure. We actually do put one wine under screw cap. There's a Tierce Riesling, a project Riesling that's made at Red New, Anthony Road, and Fox went together. And we do put that premium wine, it's a $30 wine, under screw cap. And the reason is that we think that those screw caps preserve the freshness and the flavors for a very long time. It does a beautiful job. In blind tastings, we have actually tasted that wine under screw cap, under cork, under synthetic cork, and vastly preferred the screw capped version. We love the idea. We know that there's some reluctance in the market to purchase wines in screw cap, and I believe that if you were interested in screw capping, if we put premium wines under screw cap and put our lowest end wines under, say, a synthetic cork, then maybe we could give people the idea. We could lead them to believe that a screw cap is an indication of quality over time. But the real holdback for us right now is just that our bottling equipment doesn't typically have screw capping capability, and that the cost to add on a screw capper is exorbitant. And so for many of us, it's just a question of waiting until the time comes right. I know some people have added. You have a new screw capper, don't you now?
We do.
And you do as well? It's wonderful.
So does that mean we're going to be seeing some Rieslings under screw cap?
Yeah, we do one product under a screw cap, under the Swedish Hill label at the moment. We've done several other ones. It is a situation from a winemaker standpoint. There's strong evidence that it makes sense to do it. I think it's also important to understand that no closure is perfect. Screw caps also present certain challenges. There is a dip your toe in it kind of idea right now from a marketing perspective to see what the reaction is from our consumers. Many of the wines that we're doing on screw cap now are ones that we almost sell exclusively in the tasting room. It's an opportunity, again, to talk to people directly. But they do create other challenges, both financial and from a winemaking standpoint. I think you're going to see more of it as time goes on. I share Tricia's concern from a cost standpoint for many small wineries at this stage of the game. I think it's something you'll see more of, but I think it is something that isn't a panacea. We have to approach it from a technical standpoint with some sound judgment.
Sounds good. I have to ask you guys, we actually didn't ask our first panel, but I'm going to start with you, Tricia. Could you guys give me your suggested retail price on your wine that we're pouring this evening?
I think we're at $30.
Okay, Derek,
This is $15.99.
Liz,
$12.99.
and Steve?
It's $16.95. 95, not 99.
He's going with the fives. And I think we neglected to give that information at our first flight. I apologize for that. And I'm going to go ahead and thank you very much, folks, for joining us this evening. We hope you enjoyed your lineup of Finger Lakes Rieslings, and we've had a great time presenting them to you. And thank you to the panelists. You guys did a great job. And that's it for the virtual tasting.
Thanks, Jeff.
Here, here.
Cheers.
Now they might throw some questions which we can answer on Twitter, right?